Imagine having no home, no money, and a young son depending on you. Most people would give up, but one man refused to quit. This is the true story of Chris Gardner. Some people lose everything because they make one bad decision. Chris Gardner lost everything, even after doing everything he believed was right. Imagine carrying your entire life inside a single bag. No home, no savings, no certainty about tomorrow. Now imagine holding the hand of your 5-year-old son while pretending that sleeping in a public restroom is just another adventure. That wasn't a movie. That was real. The world would eventually know Chris Gardner as a millionaire, a successful entrepreneur, and the man whose life inspired one of Hollywood's most unforgettable films. But before the applause, before the success, before the expensive suits and Wall Street meetings, there was a father desperately trying to convince his little boy that everything would be okay, even when he wasn't sure he believed it himself. But here's the part most people never hear. Chris Gardner wasn't just fighting poverty. He was fighting a lifetime of abandonment, fear, rejection, and a system that seemed determined to keep him exactly where he was. And if one tiny decision had gone differently, the story you've heard 1,000 times might never have existed. To understand how one homeless father rewrote his destiny, we have to go back to where everything truly began, long before Wall Street, long before homelessness, long before anyone believed his name was worth remembering. Chris Gardner was born on February 9, 1954, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary working-class neighborhood. Behind closed doors, it was anything but ordinary. His father wasn't there. Instead, Chris grew up under control of his abusive stepfather, a man whose anger turned the family home into a place of fear rather than comfort. For most children, home is where they learn to dream. For Chris, home became the place where survival came first. His mother, Betty Jean Gardner, loved her children deeply, but love alone couldn't stop the violence surrounding them. Arguments often exploded into terrifying confrontations. Police visits became familiar. The tension inside the house never really disappeared. As a young boy, Chris quickly learned something no child should ever have to understand. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the people you're most afraid of. But life was about to become even more painful. One day, after standing up against the abuse, Chris's mother was sent to prison. In a single moment, the only person who made him feel safe was gone. Chris and his siblings were placed into foster care. For many children, foster care means uncertainty. For Chris, it meant something even deeper. It reinforced a dangerous belief that everyone eventually leaves. Those early years planted invisible scars that would follow him for decades. He wasn't just growing up without money. He was growing up without stability, without security, without someone consistently telling him he mattered. Yet strangely, inside all that darkness, one small light refused to disappear. His mother had repeated one sentence, so often that Chris never forgot it. You can only depend on yourself. At first, those words sounded lonely. Years later, they would become the foundation of his entire life. Chris admired successful people, not because they were rich, because they looked free, free from fear, free from uncertainty, free from the helplessness he experienced almost every day without realizing it. A dream quietly began forming inside him. One day, he wouldn't just survive. He would build a completely different life. But dreams are easy when you're young. Reality has a way of testing them. After graduating from high school, Chris joined the United States Navy. For the first time, his life had structure, discipline, purpose. It wasn't glamorous, but it offered something priceless. A chance to prove to himself that he was capable of more than his childhood suggested. During his military service, Chris worked as a hospital corpsman, assisting doctors and learning valuable medical skills. One physician noticed something unusual about him. Chris learned fast. He worked harder than expected, and he stayed calm under pressure. Those qualities impressed people. For the first time in years, someone saw potential instead of problems. That small recognition mattered more than anyone realized, because confidence isn't built overnight. Sometimes It begins with one person believing in you before you believe in yourself. When his military service ended, Chris faced another difficult decision. He could continue following a safe path, or he could chase something bigger, like millions of young Americans searching for opportunity. He believed hard work would eventually be rewarded, so he accepted a job selling medical equipment. On paper, it sounded promising. Reality looked very different. His income barely covered basic expenses. The commissions were unpredictable. Bills piled up faster than paychecks. Still, Chris refused to quit. He believed success always arrived one step after people gave up. What he didn't know was that life was quietly preparing its hardest test. Around this time, Chris met Sherry Dyson. The relationship moved quickly. Like many young couples, they imagined building a future together, a stable home, financial security, a better life than the ones they'd grown up with. For a while, that dream felt possible. But dreams built on unstable foundations rarely stay standing for long. Money problems slowly invaded every conversation. Stress replaced excitement. Arguments became more frequent. Each unpaid bill created another crack in the relationship. Chris worked longer hours. He chased more sales. He sacrificed sleep. Yet, somehow, the numbers never added up. No matter how hard he worked, he always seemed one paycheck behind. Then came another life-changing moment. Their son, Christopher Jr., was born. The day Chris held his baby for the first time, everything changed. Success stopped being about expensive cars or impressive titles. It became deeply personal. Now every decision carried enormous weight. Every dollar mattered. Every mistake felt dangerous. He looked into his son's eyes and silently made himself a promise. My child will never grow up the way I did. It was a beautiful promise, but making promises is much easier than keeping them. Because while Chris was dreaming about becoming a great father, his financial situation was quietly collapsing beneath him. His medical equipment business wasn't producing enough income. Debt kept growing. Rent became harder to pay. His marriage continued falling apart. The pressure became almost unbearable. Every morning began with hope. Every evening ended with another unpaid bill. And then, one ordinary afternoon, Chris noticed something that would completely change the direction of his life. A man stepped out of a bright red Ferrari. Perfect suit, luxury watch, calm confidence. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look worried. He looked free. Chris couldn't stop staring. Finally, curiosity overcame fear. He walked up to the stranger and asked two simple questions. What do you do? And how do you do it? The man smiled. I'm a stockbroker. That conversation lasted only a few minutes. But those few minutes completely rewrote Chris Gardner's future. Because at that exact moment, he became obsessed with one impossible idea. What if Wall Street was his way out? He knew almost nothing about finance. He had no powerful connections, no prestigious college degree, no wealthy family waiting to help, just growing debt, a struggling marriage, and a dream that sounded completely unrealistic. Most people would have dismissed it immediately. Chris Gardner couldn't. He had spent his entire life watching doors close in front of him. For the first time, he believed he had finally spotted one that might actually open. The problem was, he had absolutely no idea how difficult walking through that door would become. And before Wall Street could change his life, life was about to take away almost everything he had left. The dream of becoming a stockbroker sounded exciting. Reality was ruthless. Chris quickly discovered that Wall Street wasn't looking for people like him. Most stockbrokers had prestigious college degrees, powerful connections, or families already established in finance. Chris had none of those. He was just a struggling medical equipment salesman drowning in debt. Still, he refused to let one conversation become just another forgotten memory. Every chance he got, he studied the financial world. He watched successful brokers from a distance. He practiced speaking with confidence. He imagined himself wearing the same sharp suits, walking through the same office doors. But imagination doesn't pay rent. Bills continued piling up. His medical scanners became harder and harder to sell. Hospitals delayed purchases. Potential customers canceled meetings. Every no pushed him closer to disaster. At home, The pressure became impossible to ignore. Arguments replaced conversations. Silence replaced laughter. The relationship with Sherry was falling apart, and both of them knew it. Neither wanted to admit it. But some storms can't be avoided forever. Eventually, the relationship ended. Chris wasn't just heartbroken. He was terrified. Now, he had to rebuild his life, while trying to be the father he had promised his son he would become. And life wasn't finished testing him. One afternoon, while rushing through San Francisco with one of his expensive medical scanners, Chris was stopped by the police. There was a problem he hadn't expected. Unpaid parking tickets. Years of financial chaos had finally caught up with him. He was arrested for someone already fighting to survive. Spending time in jail felt like watching every opportunity disappear. But what happened next was even worse. The morning after his release, Chris ran straight to an interview at a prestigious brokerage firm. His clothes were wrinkled. His hair was a mess. He looked nothing like the polished candidates waiting outside. He knew how ridiculous he looked. But he also knew this interview might be his only chance. Instead of pretending everything was normal, he told the truth. He explained exactly why he looked the way he did. Most people expected the interview to end right there. Instead, something unexpected happened. His honesty impressed them. His confidence stood out. His intelligence became impossible to ignore. Against all odds, he was offered a place in their stockbroker training program. For one brief moment, it felt like everything was finally changing, until Chris heard one sentence. The internship was unpaid. No salary, no guaranteed job, no promise of success. Just months of intense competition. Only the top performers would be hired permanently. Everyone else would leave with nothing. For most people, the decision would have been easy. They couldn't afford to work for free. Chris couldn't either. But he also knew opportunities like this rarely appeared twice, that if he walked away, he might spend the rest of his life wondering what could have happened. So he made one of the most dangerous decisions of his life. He accepted. Every morning before sunrise, Chris put on his only good suit. Every evening, he returned to a life that was falling apart. The internship demanded everything. Long hours, constant pressure, cold calls, learning complex financial markets, competing against candidates with far more experience. Chris couldn't waste a single minute. While others took long coffee breaks, he stayed at his desk. While others chatted, he made another phone call. He discovered that if he skipped unnecessary breaks, he could reach more clients than anyone else. It was a small adjustment, but over time, small advantages became massive ones. Still, his financial situation continued collapsing. Rent went unpaid. The landlord lost patience. Then came the day Chris had feared for months. He opened the apartment door and realized it wasn't his home anymore. He had been evicted. Everything he owned had to fit inside a few bags. Furniture was gone. Security was gone. The illusion of stability disappeared overnight. Standing beside him was his young son. Too young to understand why strangers were taking away their home. Too innocent to know that his father had no idea where they would sleep that night. Chris forced a smile, because sometimes parents carry pain their children should never have to see. That first night without a home, he searched desperately for somewhere safe. Cheap hotels, friends, anything. Most doors stayed closed. Money disappeared faster than hope. Every dollar became a decision. Food or transportation. A place to sleep or another day chasing the dream. Chris chose the dream, again and again, because quitting now would guarantee failure forever. But the hardest night still hadn't arrived. One evening, after another exhausting day at the brokerage office, Chris realized every shelter nearby was already full. No beds, no rooms, nowhere to go. His son looked up at him with complete trust. "Dad, where are we sleeping tonight?" Chris didn't have an answer. He walked through crowded subway stations, searching for somewhere hidden. Finally, he found a public restroom. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even safe, but it had a lock. He carried his son inside. He laid paper towels on the floor, held his son close, locked the door, and prayed no one would come in. Outside, people banged on the restroom door, angry that it was occupied. Inside, Chris sat silently in the darkness, tears running down his face. Not because he was homeless, because his son was. That night became the lowest point of his entire life. Everything he had worked for, everything he believed, everything he had sacrificed seemed completely meaningless. But as impossible as it sounds, that bathroom floor also became the place where Chris made the most important decision of his life. He could surrender, or he could survive one more day, one more interview, one more client, one more chance. He chose tomorrow. Again, and again, and again. He had no guarantee that tomorrow would be better. Only one belief refused to die. If I keep moving, eventually something has to change. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere inside the brokerage office, one opportunity was quietly waiting for him. And that opportunity would soon determine whether Chris Gardner remained another forgotten homeless father or became one of the greatest comeback stories in modern history. Most people think Chris Gardner's greatest battle was surviving homelessness. It wasn't. The real battle began the next morning, because while the world saw a homeless man, Wall Street expected a future stockbroker. Every sunrise started the same way. Chris would wake up before his son. He'd quietly gather their few belongings, making sure Christopher never saw how desperate their situation really was. Some mornings, they stayed in homeless shelters. Other nights, they found space in churches. And when every bed was taken, they searched for another place that could simply keep them safe until morning. Then Chris would do something almost unbelievable. He would put on his only business suit, straighten his tie, polish his shoes as best he could, take a deep breath, and walk into one of the most competitive financial firms in America as if nothing was wrong. No one in the office knew the truth. They didn't know the man making confident phone calls all day had spent the previous night wondering where his son would sleep. They didn't know the polished suit covered a life that was completely falling apart. Chris had become an expert at hiding pain, but pretending was exhausting. Every afternoon, while other interns planned dinner or relaxed after work, Chris rushed across the city to pick up Christopher from daycare before it closed. If he arrived late, he risked losing the only safe place his son had during the day. So every second mattered. Every train, every traffic light, every missed opportunity. His life had become a race against time. Yet despite the pressure, Chris refused to let fear control him. He noticed something about the other trainees. Many worked hard, but they didn't always work smart. Some spent too much time preparing before making calls. Others hesitated after hearing rejection. Chris couldn't afford hesitation. He developed a simple rule. Every minute had to produce value. Instead of taking long breaks, he stayed at his desk. Instead of overthinking each conversation, he made one more call, then another, then another. Rejection became part of his daily routine. Most people hate hearing the word no. Chris learned to treat every no as one step closer to a yes. Slowly, his numbers began improving. Managers started noticing. Clients remembered his confidence. His energy stood out. But there was one thing they still didn't know. Every evening, after leaving the office, Chris wasn't going home. He was beginning another search for somewhere to survive the night. And somehow, he never allowed that reality to affect the way he treated clients. One day, a senior manager quietly watched Chris from across the office. There was something different about him. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the most experienced. But he had something impossible to teach. Relentless focus. Chris understood something many people never do. Success isn't always about talent. Sometimes it's about refusing to stop after everyone else already has. That mindset slowly separated him from the competition. Still, the internship was nearing its end. Only one question mattered now. Who would get the job? Everyone knew only a handful of trainees would receive permanent offers. The rest would walk away empty-handed. For Chris, failure wasn't just disappointing. It was catastrophic. There was no backup plan, no savings account, no family waiting with financial support. If he lost this opportunity, he and his son could lose everything. The pressure became almost unbearable. Every phone call felt like it could change his future. Every meeting carried enormous weight. Every mistake seemed bigger than ever before. Yet Chris never allowed panic to replace discipline. He kept showing up, kept smiling, kept believing, even when belief was the only thing he still owned. Then came the day that would decide everything. The trainees were called into the office. One by one, names were announced. Every second felt longer than the last. Chris waited. His heart pounded. His hands trembled. He thought about his childhood, his abusive home, the foster care system, his mother, the nights without food, the bathroom floor where he held his sleeping son. All of it had led to the single moment. Then he heard his name, Chris Gardner. For a second, he couldn't move. The room around him faded into silence. He had done it, against every prediction, against every statistic, against every obstacle. The homeless father had earned his place on Wall Street. Chris later admitted that he tried to stay calm, but the emotions were too overwhelming. Years of pain, years of rejection, years of wondering whether he was enough, finally collided with one unforgettable moment. He walked outside the building. People passed him without noticing anything unusual, but Chris knew his life had just changed forever. He looked up at the sky, clapped his hands once, and quietly fought back tears. Not because he had become rich, because he had finally been given a chance, a real chance. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Getting the job wasn't the finish line. It was only the beginning. Wall Street would test him in ways he had never imagined. The road ahead would demand even greater discipline, even bigger risks, and impossible decisions that could either build a fortune or destroy everything he had just fought so hard to earn. And what Chris Gardner chose to do next would transform him from a struggling stockbroker into a millionaire whose story would inspire millions around the world. Landing the job didn't erase Chris Gardner's past. It simply gave him a chance to build a different future. For years, he had been fighting just to survive. Now, he had to prove that he belonged in one of the most competitive industries in the world. Every morning, while many of his co-workers chased commissions, Chris chased something bigger, freedom. He remembered every cold night, every empty pocket, every moment he had looked into his son's eyes and pretended everything would be okay. Those memories became fuel. They reminded him that failure was no longer an option. As a stockbroker, Chris built his reputation the same way he had rebuilt his life, one relationship at a time. He listened more than he spoke. He earned trust before asking for business. He treated every client with respect, whether they invested thousands of dollars or millions. Slowly, his client list grew. So did his confidence. The man who once questioned his own worth was becoming someone others trusted with their financial future. But Chris wasn't chasing money just to become wealthy. He wanted something money couldn't buy: control over his life, the ability to protect his son from the uncertainty he had lived through, and the chance to prove that your past does not have to decide your future. Years later, after gaining experience on Wall Street, Chris made another decision that terrified almost everyone around him. He left the security of working for someone else. Starting his own brokerage firm sounded risky. Many people thought he was making a mistake. After everything he had survived, why gamble again? Because Chris understood something powerful. Sometimes the biggest risk is spending your entire life building someone else's dream. In 1987, he founded Gardner Rich & Company, an independent brokerage firm in Chicago. It wasn't an overnight success. There were long hours, difficult decisions, and constant pressure. But unlike the man who once feared losing everything, this version of Chris had something far more valuable than money: experience, discipline, and the confidence that comes from surviving life's worst days. The business grew. His reputation spread. The father who once stood in line at homeless shelters was now advising successful investors. The transformation seemed unbelievable, yet the greatest reward wasn't found in bank accounts. It was found in keeping the promise he had made years earlier. His son would never have to live the childhood he did. That promise had finally become reality. Then something unexpected happened. Hollywood came calling. Chris Gardner's incredible journey caught the attention of filmmakers. His autobiography became the foundation for the 2006 film, The Pursuit of Happyness. Millions of people watched his story unfold on the big screen. Well, Smith portrayed Chris with remarkable emotion, while Will's real-life son, Jaden Smith, played Christopher. For audiences around the world, it felt like an inspiring movie. For Chris, it was his life. The famous scene of father and son sleeping in a subway restroom wasn't created to make people cry. It happened. The desperation, the fear, the determination, it was all real. But even after worldwide recognition, Chris never allowed success to erase the lessons of struggle. He became a motivational speaker, traveling across the world and reminding people that success isn't reserved for the lucky. It's earned by those who refuse to quit when life gives them every reason to. People often ask what changed Chris Gardner's life. Was it meeting the man in the Ferrari, getting accepted into the internship, landing the Wall Street job, starting his own company? Those moments mattered, but they weren't the true turning point. The real turning point happened on the nights when no one was watching, when he chose hope over despair, action over excuses, tomorrow over surrender, because that's where extraordinary lives are really built, not under bright lights, not in front of cameras, but in the quiet moments where nobody would blame you for giving up, yet you decide to keep going anyway. Chris Gardner's journey proves something most people underestimate. Circumstances can delay your future. They can test your patience. They can break your confidence. But they do not have the final word unless you let them. Today, Chris Gardner's name is recognized around the world, not because he became rich, but because he showed that resilience can rewrite a life. His story isn't about Wall Street. It isn't about money, and it isn't even about success. It's about a father who refused to let his son inherit hopelessness, a man who transformed pain into purpose, and living proof that sometimes the greatest investment you'll ever make is believing in yourself when no one else does. So the next time life convinces you that your circumstances define your future, remember the homeless father carrying everything he owned in a single bag, walking into a Wall Street office with a smile, while secretly wondering where his child would sleep that night. If he could keep moving through that darkness, maybe your next step is all it takes to begin your own transformation. And perhaps the life you're dreaming about isn't as far away as it feels today. If the story changed the way you see struggle, don't stop here. The next documentary, waiting in the description, tells the story of another person who turned impossible odds into an extraordinary life. Watch it next. You might discover that the greatest success stories all begin the same way, with someone refusing to quit. If you enjoy powerful documentaries about ambition, history, business, survival, and unbelievable true transformations, subscribe to Rise from Zero and become part of a community that believes every setback can become the beginning of something extraordinary, because every legend starts from zero.